So this video series that we're doing with CPRE, it's focused around the problems and the mechanisms, the causes, and then the solutions in the education labor market. So one of the reasons I was so excited to have you join us is that your work on teachers unions is intimately tied with the labor market, but I'm not entirely sure where to place your work on unions and unions in general into this problem mechanism solution paradigm. It's a very political topic. There's some folks that are going to think that unions are the problem themselves. Some folks are going to think that they cause the problem. Other folks that are going to think that they can solve the problems. Where do you see unions situated in this overall context?
I get asked this question a lot about where are unions, and the answer is I think that they're here to stay, right? So I don't know that it matters, right? So unions are very powerful, organized organizations. They're put into place for a very good reason. They have very strong reasons to be where they are, and they're not going to go anywhere. So given that, what do we do now, right? I think that we need to understand that unions do influence the labor market in massive ways. They do it on every level, right? So unions have very strong political and lobbying arms that influence the national and state a way that we think about policies being put into place. I live in California. It's very evident here, but it's also evident on the national scene. So they are very much integrated into the way that policymakers make policies that dictate how teachers can be prepared, where teachers should teach, how we evaluate them. Every part of a teacher labor market, right? Unions have a role in that. But also at the district level, which is mostly what I study, the local level, unions, they negotiate collective bargaining agreements, and that is like a very important role that I think goes understudied. And what the CBAs do is they dictate almost every single part of a teacher's working day or working year. So everything from when they get to school, when they leave school, how much we pay them, the way that they can transfer around the district. And these things have massive implications for teacher labor market supply and distribution. And I think that we need to be aware of these things and the details of what unions do so we can work with them to try to implement policies that are that help us to distribute teachers where they need to be.
Do you see a way that the incentives for unions could be more aligned to those equity goals and distributional aims?
I think that there are ways that we could think about working with unions to do this. So some unions have been willing to think about how we compensate teachers a little differently. So never off a salary schedule, but how might we provide incentives for certain kinds of positions? So in California, where I study, the majority of districts have some sort of incentive built into salary schedules about bilingual or ELL teachers or special education teachers. So we're trying to attract, we're willing to pay them bonuses to attract them, right? That is not traditionally what unions have done in the past, but as these teachers become so high need, the shortage areas are these areas, they're willing to say, well, maybe we need to pay them a little more to bring them to our district. So that's an example where we could work with unions to kind of create incentives for teachers. I was on a panel once with a union leader at a conference, and when asked what the one thing that person would never let go of in negotiations, his answer was seniority. I think that is a really strong problem when we think about distributing teachers across schools and districts, because if you have strong seniority provisions in your contracts, and not just the ones that we think about, seniority rights transfers, but there's lots of places seniority pops up in CBAs. Teachers end up in the schools where they probably, principals may not want them, right, or need them. So it really does hamstring principals' ability to put a teacher in the school that would be the best fit or the most need for that kind of teacher. And so I think there's a strong place for unions to get involved and say, how can we better reward teachers who committed to the profession, have been here for a long time? There's got to be other ways to reward them than giving them the ability to pick the, for the lack of a better word, best working conditions or easiest teaching positions.
So that's it's a nice transition into you mentioned the CBAs and the collective bargaining agreement. In the past, in the 80s and the 90s, the research on unions was very blunt, very binary, like do we have unions or do we not have unions? And recently we've seen a lot more research that's more nuanced. Your work is definitely leading the way in this. That's looking not do we have unions or do we not have unions, but let's look at the actual contract and what do we know about the context, the restrictions and the permissions that unions grant. What areas of the contract have you focused on?
Lucky for me, I focus on all. So I have read all 500 and something CBAs in California that are for districts with 4 or more schools. So some of them range from 25 pages to 400 pages. And so I look at all the provisions in the contract. And I think I code for about 700 of them, maybe 800 now, to understand exactly what are the details, what are the regulations that are in CBAs. So the minutia that you don't think is important, these things still do, either constrain administrators or give them leeway to do what they need to do. There's no judgment on if this is a good or bad thing. It's simply understanding how do CBAs impact kind of the flexibility that administrators have to operate and manage schools. So I get to look at them all, and then I divide them up into different areas, like association rights, which are simple things like, does the union leader get the year off with their union leaders to kind of do union business, which is a big cost to the district. They get full pay in some districts, sometimes they don't get full pay. What kind of vacation time what time off do union representatives get? Can they use the school at X certain hours? Things like that you wouldn't think are important, but actually do then limit the flexibility of administrators. Then I look at things like transfer and vacancy provisions, have to do with seniority, but also other things. How many times can a teacher be transferred in a given year? Compensation items, which aren't just salary schedules, but actually are things like these incentives I was talking about earlier, or the regulations around compensation, even now getting more and more into retirement benefits, right? Those are getting put into the CBAs.
So you mentioned that you code for 700, you have 700 codes, which is 700 categories that you're looking at, right?
Provisions, yeah.
Provision with, is there, where's the action within those in terms of the variation between districts? I imagine there's a lot of similarities, but where's the variation between districts? And then you mentioned contracts that change over time. Are you noticing trends in what tends to change over time?
The second question is a good one, and stay tuned. So we're doing that analysis now. And we're looking at, again, across these 3 different states to see what changes. And obviously there's different policy changes in those states. And so we'll be able to see if that's actually causing some of these changes. In terms of variation across districts, we thought when I went into this work, I'm not going to tell you how long ago, I started thinking, all contracts probably are the same, just a little bit of variation. It's actually not the case. Contracts are very different by context. I find that districts that are lower income and that are in urban areas with kind of more minority students tend to have more restrictive contracts and tend to have strong provisions around seniority, around working conditions, around leave. So you can look at that in a couple different ways. The way that I tend to interpret that is these are harder to staff positions. Teachers don't really want to go to these districts as much. So give them more working conditions, and they also can't probably afford to pay higher salaries. So give them better working conditions, and then they'll be able to not maybe attract some of these teachers. So it's a catch-22 because we often know there's an association between stronger contracts and lower student achievement.
So what have you learned? You've been able to look into these in California extensively, and you're broadening out to other states. The Dan Goldaber you worked with to replicate the method in Washington. What have we learned about looking into these contract provisions?
I think the thing that is the most important that we've learned is how complex these things are and how important the policies are that are in them. And so this is the first time we've got a more recent and Terry Moe has done some of this work as well, recent and massive data set that shows us, wow, not only do these things dictate the big picture things, but we actually see the very small intricacies that really matter for budgets and matter for operations and might actually matter for student achievement. So it's kind of being able to really understand the detail that I think has been coming out of this.